think the book pretty much as is. I wouldn't change a thing. Now, there's been a lot that we've learned since, and there's been a variety of projects that we're putting out there to supplement it. The whole idea of proof of life, is there a deal, and is the deal with you? It never occurred to me that that would be a big problem in the business world, that people would be constantly engaged in negotiations, having no intention of ever making the deal. Or there's one thing that we're talking about now, contemplation, working back and forth with Derek Gaunt. There's something we call the agreement graveyard. Even if you got proof of life on the deal, that's not necessarily going to keep it out of the graveyard.
Chris Voss, my good friend, is here with me today on Questionable. Chris, I saw you in Kentucky for our secret project a couple weeks ago. Everything good?
Everything is great, man. Yeah, we keep bumping into each other in these black site locations, don't we?
It's yes, which shall all be revealed to the world when the time is right. Those of you who don't know, I did the documentary on Chris and Black Swan Group that is coming out soon. We'll have updates on that as well. Chris, one of the things that I wanted to dig in a little bit here, the whole theme of this podcast is that you can learn the most by asking the right questions. And by the way, we can talk about this too. Some of the nuance in things is also what you do and don't say, which I'm sure is important in negotiation, whether it's in business or in your former life in hostage negotiation. But one of the things I think that fascinates me is all the biographies and documentaries that I do. I choose to do them based on people who are celebrities in their own right for whatever reason, but that's not why I do it.
Celebrities in my own mind, is that it?
No, in their own right. No, not in your own mind. No, you're beyond that. But we should all be celebrities in our own mind. It's more fun that way.
Yeah.
But when I dig into it, the only reason I do these things is because the people I work with are so good at what they do, the world can't ignore them. Yet rarely does the world know the rest of the story. And I find it interesting that it's normal. Every one of us in everyday life, we sort of project our own stories, our own ideas onto someone else's story, and we think we have the answer. And one thing that I think is really interesting about, getting to know you and your story is learning the rest of your story that, maybe is covered a little bit in masterclass or in your book, Never Split the Difference, but maybe people gloss over it, or maybe you just haven't talked a lot about it. But one of the things that I just thought, by the way, that you had done a few years, whatever that was, in the FBI, and then you decided you become a speaker and a writer, and you're going to share that message. Talk a little bit about how long you spent in the FBI, and maybe why you decided to, really retire from the FBI after a full career.
Yeah, well, it was 24 years in total. I mean, my law enforcement time was 27 years. I was 3 years and a couple of months, a couple of weeks in with the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department, and then transitioned over to the FBI. 24 years there. And as I was getting close to my eligibility, actually, a year before I left the bureau, I probably had no intention of leaving. The eligibility was a minimum of 20 years and a minimum of being at least age 50. And everybody said, when you're going to get out, you really need to start planning about 5 years out. And the Bureau has a system where they'll send you to this retirement conference if you're a year from eligibility. And I didn't bother going to the retirement conference because, at that point in time, I had no intention of leaving. I think things were rocking. It was really good. I had a legitimate shot at, the brass ring for FBI hostage negotiators, which was to be in charge of the overall crisis negotiation unit. I was in charge of international kidnapping at the time. And things changed. Somebody else got the promotion, and Iraq kicked off in a really big way. It was an ongoing struggle as to whether or not hostage negotiators were going to get deployed operationally to Iraq. It was the absurdities of government. They were sending negotiators there to teach hostage negotiation, but simultaneously the bureaucracy refused to allow me to go there operationally. That was an internal struggle, multi-government agency struggle. State Department counterterrorism. I had some allies over there that were helping me to try to get in, and the rest of the State Department wasn't particularly interested because overseas belongs to the Department of State, and the fewer competitors they have, then the fewer elbows get thrown around. And I thought either I was first, I got passed over for the job, which was a blessing in disguise. And then I thought we were going to get deployed on a regular basis operationally to Iraq. It was a struggle that I had fought for some time. And I thought at the very end of 2006 that I was a struggle that had finally been won. And the guy that was my new boss had other ideas, and he had a very different agenda for what the unit was doing and what I was doing, and we were not in alignment, and he was in charge. Now, last time that I was out of alignment with someone that I was accountable to was towards 1999, and when I was still in New York, and I made the decision to move on. Whether you like it or not, being out of alignment with the people you work for is ultimately bodes poorly for you, regardless
Yeah.
of whether or not they're right or wrong. They're still in charge. And when I left New York to become a full-time hostage negotiator, my life got much better. And I, as they say, you know, a door closes, a window opens. Well, the door slammed shut on me in New York, and I went out the side window, and it got great. So when a similar thing happened, 2006, I thought, well, the last time I moved on, my life just got infinitely better when I made the move. And I didn't resent it at all. And I thought, this is the opportunity for me to leave. I had kind of an exit strategy in mind. In 2004, I'd been exposed to a program at Harvard, Kennedy School of Government, called their mid-career program, where they brought in people. You could get a master's in a year based on your life experience. And the only requirement really was that, first of all, that you qualify, and secondly, that you have been doing something for the public sector, and your intention was to continue in some fashion to work for the public sector. And you come in and you got a shot at this program. So I thought, all right, this has been in my back pocket for a while. I'm going to go jump into Harvard. And I left the bureau and I went and got my master's at Harvard.
What was it like? I mean, obviously, this is a special program at Harvard. Do you feel like, did you get the whole Harvard experience? And what was your experience at Harvard? What was that like? How, like, my experience in law school was the people weren't much different than the people I was with in undergrad. And for some reason, I had this expectation that everyone was going to be a ton smarter and it was going to be way harder, but it was like more of the same for me. So I just wonder what was Harvard like?
You know, it was really special. The mid-career program are people from around the world that are transitioning their lives. Now, I had crossed paths with these folks, these people, this breed of character, when I went through the Harvard Law School's negotiation course in 2000. Can't remember if I went through in 2004, 2006. And when I went through as a student, while I was still with the FBI, they had one particular exercise that was designed to teach the Harvard Law School students not to withhold material information. The deception by omission is a frequent and common problem in the world. Well, I never lied. I just didn't tell you the whole truth. That's deception by omission. And they ran an exercise that I was really impressed with when I went through the law school to teach them that lesson. And I was immensely gratified that Bob Mnookin was so adamant that the lesson be taught. And I was horrified that it had to be taught. And the number of law school students that would argue, come up with these eloquent, beautiful justifications for withholding material facts was horrifying to me. You know, these are the people, they are so smart, and Harvard Law School graduates, I mean, they're going to influence the entire planet, and they have to be taught to be honest, and they fought it. But inside this group, there was a small number of older students that were savvier, and none of them bet. Like, not a one of them withheld the material information. They all like, nah, you got to be honest. You got to have your integrity no matter what. That's the most important thing. And I finally took a couple of them off to the side, and I go like, who are you guys? Like, yeah, we're from the Kennedy School. We're in this program. It's called the mid-career program. I mean, these people with all this life seasoning. And I remember thinking, like, I want to hang out with you guys. You guys are the ones that I want to learn from. And so the Kennedy School draws this global conglomeration of 190 some experienced, extraordinary people. And like the journalists from all over the world. They make it a point of bringing these journalists in worldwide. And most of the journalists that come in under the special program, they come from somewhere in the developing world where their choice was go to jail or leave the country. They had such an impact on whatever corrupt government that they tried to expose that the government didn't really want to throw them in jail, but they said, you got to get out of here. And so all these people from all over the world with this great experience. And it was a really phenomenal, special group of people that I was totally impressed with based on their navigation of the world and their worldview.
What how was it hard? Like I found one of the things like in law school there's I don't know if they still do it or not, but it was basically a bell curve. For every A there was an F, for every B there was a D. And you just had to be smarter than a couple people not to fail, and you had to be smarter than a couple more to get to get a C. And if you actually put the work in most cases, a B was possible and the odd A was possible. So it just worked differently than everything else I'd done. How hard did you find it? And was there anything that caught you by surprise like that? Like I didn't know there's an F for every A. Anything like that in there?
Well, it was hard if you didn't work hard. I mean, it's not for the lazy. And one of the things about the program was you had to come be a full-time student. You couldn't be part-time. You couldn't do it virtual. You got to show up and you got to be there full-time. And it's hard in that, they're bringing a lot of oldsters like me in, and it's probably been a while since we've run a lot of hard numbers. So they actually bring
Yeah.
you in a month early, and they make sure that you're up to speed on some of the core concepts of economics and data collection and data distribution and the latest ways of handling data. And then they really they try to drown you with reading. Like they give you more reading than you could possibly handle, and you sort of freak out. Like I got more reading in this one class than I could do, and I got four classes.
Hmm.
And so then you start to divide up the reading, and then you start to figure it out. And then what you figure out really is show up for every class, participate to the max. I mean, be as engaged as you possibly can by showing up in person. And you're going to pass. You're going to get a B if you show up and you work hard and you think. And if you're lazy, you're going to run into trouble. So what they really want to do, a little bit like life is pretty much overwhelming. So what's the best way for me to handle this? If I show up all the time and I work really hard. When you first get up there, it's pretty scary because it's like, man, I can't. There's too much here for me to handle, and you start collaborating, and you get into it. And a few weeks in, a few people whisper to you off to the side, like, "Look, man, just show up and do the work. The reading will come to you. The high points will come to you. Just show up all the way, and you'll be okay."
It makes sense. What what were there exams? What was the testing like, or how'd you get other than good participation? How'd you get your grades?
Yeah, it was dependent upon the instructor. It might be a series of projects that you would put in. It might be an essay exam. It might be a multiple choice exam. Each instructor had their own way of doing things. A lot of them liked essays. I think that an essay gives a professor a lot of subjective latitude to drop a grade, and some of them are keeping track of how much you participate in class. If you run into trouble, do you keep your mouth shut? Do you reach out for them? I had one particular class that I felt like I was drowning a little bit, and I made an appointment with the professor to sit down and talk with them and get my feet under me. So you're going to get every kind of thing thrown at you, and then their little tricks. At the time when I went through, the voice dictation software had just started. The first one they had to pay for, in the olden times, you had to pay for voice dictation. I had this
Right, right.
Dragon naturally speaking thing.
I remember that. Yep.
And so like I couldn't type up an 8-page paper, but I could dictate it. And the funny thing was, when you're dictating, it transposes the words to words that sound like what you meant to say.
Yeah.
And you got an 8-page paper and you don't notice that the word actually spelled a completely different word. And one of my professors sent me a note saying, your thinking is really different, different slant on things. Sometimes it's confusing, but I really like your perspective. I go back and my dragon had changed words around and I didn't realize it.
Siri does that to me sometimes too, but yeah, that's she just turned on. Interesting. So yeah, I remember similarly. Well, look, the program is obviously intentionally designed to overwhelm you and to make you collaborate and do those things. So once you learn those lessons, you look back and I'm sure you go, okay, yeah, that makes sense. And you probably learned a lot from doing that. The law school is similar, and I don't know what you would consider more reading than one could do. But we were about 100 pages a night of cases that you're supposed to brief. And I think I might have read that many pages one night of my 3 years of law
Right.
school. I was like, that is not for me. And I figured out that you couldn't be unprepared totally, but there were ways to read excerpts and summaries, and if you could think and you were willing to participate, you would get away. You would do fine, and then you just had to do well enough on the test and not look like a total loser in class, so that you wouldn't get docked, participation points and other things. Or again, there would be the latitude for the professor to say, he worked really hard to do that. It's funny. I actually, my first semester of law school, I don't think I've ever told this story publicly. I took a professor for it's like a contracts class, I think it was, like a business thing. And I had businesses from undergrad. I was running a business during college. Like, I understood business. And I have, you'd never know this. No, you know this very well. I have severe ADHD. So for me, the only way to like actually accomplish something is to hyper focus for a very small amount of time. Like, I think people all the time think like I'm trying to get off the phone with you. The only reason I'm trying to get off the phone with you is because if I don't do whatever we just talked about, I will never remember it in 4 minutes from now. Or like, I hyper focus to get the conversation, and then like I'm done. Like, my brain is done. So I gotta move on to something else. And so my very first law school exam, people are, freaking out, throwing up, having sick stomachs. I'm like, everyone by this point, everyone's at least 22, 23 years old. Right. And it's like, you've been doing this since you were 5. Like, what are you freaking out about? Like, we're professional students at this point. Like, what are you doing? And, this is my very first law school exam. I walked in, I hyper focused. I finished the exam in 38 minutes. We had 3.5 hours to take the exam.
Wow.
So I get up to go turn my exam in, and like my friends all look at me like, "What, are you dropping out? Like, you figure this isn't for you? Like, what's going on?" And so I couldn't say anything. So I turned in my exam, and it was multiple choice and essays. And so I did everything I knew, and I studied, and I thought I did fine. I did all my exams, and I got mostly B's and a couple C's, which for me was more than fine in law school. I didn't really even want to be there. I just knew I should get the degree. And that's an interesting idea too, just how much I would have learned had I tried to enjoy it. But at 22, you're not really ready for that, I think, or I wasn't. And so I got a D plus from that professor. And I remember thinking I didn't deserve a D plus, but it was still a pass. So, okay. But I didn't when you get into a good school, good undergrad, like you have A's your whole life, like you're not used to getting D's. So I'm like, I'm not going to let this guy beat me. Like, I feel like this is personal. So I took another class with a guy, and I get to a lot of tests in law school are open book, because you can cite things, you can do research. You don't have time to read everything. Like, you have to know your stuff, but if you need to cite something or look something up, you can, because you can do that. If you're a practicing lawyer, you can look up case briefs, you can do other things. So I got to this subject, and I had never even heard. I hadn't done my reading, of course, and I'd never heard of this idea, this topic. So I look it up in the index, and I find it by name. And then I go to this case, and the case in the book is literally the exact same case on my test with the names changed. So for my final feat of this exam, I just copied the entire judge's opinion and changed the names to the names on the test, and I got an A in the class. So I found his number. Like, he literally just copied the case. So I copied the case too and just changed the names. But law school was quite an adventure, and that was how I learned. All right, I can do this. I just got to get through. Yeah, Chris. So you went to Harvard. I think something that a lot of people don't know too is you end up teaching at Harvard and at Georgetown for a while. What prompted that, and what was that like? Obviously, two extremely major institutions, very very prestigious. What was that like?
When I was on the teaching staff at the law school, they can't make you full sort of lecturer professor if you're not a lawyer. They got a thing.
What rules against that? Yeah.
So I had gone through as a student, and it was when I was at the Kennedy School, and the law school's big focus every year. The biggest, the most important negotiation class they teach is the one in the break between the fall and the spring semester. It's an extended period of time. A lot of professors load up, and they teach an all-day, everyday course for 13 straight days.
Hmm.
A lot of students go on vacation, go skiing. Some students, their entire time, they're there for the class in the winter break. There's a leadership class everybody wants to go to.
Huh.
There's 3 or 4 classes that is the winter break class is the class.
Huh.
And so I was trying to decide what I was going to do in that time frame. I was actually thinking about taking a leadership class, and Sheila Heen, who had been the instructor for the section that I'd been in when I went through as a student, she reached out to me and she said, "Hey, look, come be my teaching assistant. And, we'll teach side by side. But then, you'll get your teaching, you'll get a credential having taught and been on the teaching staff at the law school." And simultaneously, I said, "Well, I got a credit I want to pick up." And she said, "Well, I'll be your professor overseeing the class you want to teach. And, so you teach alongside me. You bring the hostage negotiation stuff that you know thoroughly, which you demonstrated, and then you get your credential for teaching, and I'll give you the other class and supervise that credit." So I go through, and I'm much more involved now and seeing the behind the scenes workings of how they're putting the course together, and whose emphasis is what, and how they're letting everybody work. And working with Sheila was a phenomenal experience. I mean, she's still one of the best people I've ever met on planet Earth. Really smart, very positive, very very optimistic, very very positive person.
Yep.
So they got both her and her husband, John Richardson. They became a little more familiar with my ideas and how I taught negotiation, and learned a lot more about teaching. It was the first time I was participating in grading graduate level stuff. And so then a year later, I'm out, and by now the 2007, 2008 recession is kicked into full gear, and there's no work anywhere. Like I got out of Harvard, I figured, and I'm going to go to New York. This is going to fall into place. This is going to fall into place. And none of it did. I'm staring down the barrel of just the beginnings of the recession. No work anywhere. I gotta live on my pension, and it's not looking good. Go back to D.C. because it's where my boat was, and I could live there the cheapest while I'm trying to pick up the pieces. Recession comes in full gear, and just like there are no jobs, no opportunity anywhere, which is a great time to start a business because you're not riding a downturn. And you don't realize it, but you're starting at the bottom of the market. You're buying a stock at its lowest point. You haven't lost all that value. And I didn't have to go through anything of businesses just curtailing and laying people off. Thank
Right.
God I didn't have to go through any of that. So then a few months after that, Sheila's husband, John, reaches out for me and he says, "Hey, look, today's Thursday and a class starts Tuesday to teach at the Harvard Extension, which is graduate level night school, basically." He says, "I'd love to co-teach with you. Here's the deal. We'll co-teach it. I've got a syllabus already dialed in for the entire course. I'll add your name to the syllabus. It'll be a syllabus now authored by the two of us. and you show up, and I know based on what you've done with Sheila, how your stories fit into what I'm teaching, and you're kind of the color commentator. I'll talk about the specific concept and negotiation academically, and then you step up. I know your stories, and you tell the story that supports it, and we'll co-teach this thing, and I will split the fee for teaching, and that's going to pay for you to fly up here, and you can stay at Sheila and me's house, Sheila and my house, so you don't have to pay for a hotel when you fly up, and you get the full teaching experience. I'm like, wow, yeah, and nothing else was going on. So to do something effectively for no money and only the experience and the credential at that level was more than worth it for me. I'll forever be grateful to John and Sheila for giving me those opportunities. So I roll out of there, and we teach a semester, and I'm much more. He explains to me the best way to judge students, and like, I'm not used to being a professor. Like, this is the first time, I pass in the students in the hall, and they're going like, "Professor, professor," and I keep walking. I'm wondering, who the hell are they talking to? Professor Voss, and I'm like, yeah, it's me. I'm a professor. And I finish up with that, and I get back to DC, and still nothing really going on. But I hear through the grapevine that Georgetown has a position open in the MBA program for somebody to teach negotiation, and as an adjunct. And I reach out and I talk to the department chair, and she says, "Well, yeah, we got an opening. I mean, I know you're a former hostage negotiator, but where have you taught?" And I go, "I taught at Harvard." She goes, "Really?" She said, "Have you got a syllabus?" I said, "As a matter of fact, I do." And I sent her the syllabus that John and I had worked on together. And by and large, it was mostly, just John adding me to his syllabus.
Right.
And it was 14 sessions. It was either 14 or 16 3-hour classes, and the Georgetown thing was only 7. And I supply them, with my resume and a syllabus, and they go, "Oh, you got the job." And I'm like, holy shit, now what do I do? Because I'd had Sheila there, I'd had John there, and this was half the size. I'm like, I got to cut this baby down and make this work. And I talked to one of the other adjuncts that was there, and he laid out for me kind of what the game plan was. And I jumped in, and then every class I taught Georgetown, as an adjunct, you're hired and fired for every class. You are the help. You're a contractor. And every time I taught, I learned a little bit more about it, and I loved it a little bit more, and students made better deals.
All that's fascinating, and it makes sense why your master class is so popular. It makes sense why the book is so good. It makes sense why people learn so much in your seminars. But again, I think that's so interesting that most people wouldn't really know those things, and how, so you worked on the art of teaching, and that's a different skill. Teaching is even hard to teach people how to do, but getting it in the trenches with master teachers at some of the best institutions in the country doesn't hurt your resume at all, but also, taught you to teach. And I would guess when you were deciding to write the book, then you already had a framework for maybe the stories that worked best and the stories that didn't translate as well as to what made people lean in, and maybe what you were surprised about that people liked because you'd had time to test the work. Am I correct in that?
Yeah, well, and I worked hard at everything. There isn't anything that anybody's really good at that they don't work hard at. I can't remember who wrote the phrase, hard work beats talent if talent doesn't work hard. And I think and talent never works hard. People that are enormously gifted very rarely work hard, and you can beat them just by outworking them. There's the competition's going to quit. Just don't quit. Molly Bloom says you can't lose if you don't quit. Well, your competition's going to quit. And one of the things that I've always prided myself on when in working with Jonathan Smith, the U.S. coordinator, or we were working on the book, the work ethic from my family is to outwork everybody. You're going to have a hard time outworking a Voss. Between my father, me, my son, you're going to have a tough time outworking us. And I worked hard at teaching. In the early days of the FBI hostage negotiation program, they put an emphasis on you getting out there and teaching the moment you got out of the training. And I had been teaching on the suicide hotline because I got bad at it. I let my skills erode. And as I started to study why my skills eroded, and I was discussing it with the people at the hotline, they said, "You got to teach. You've dug into this so deeply. We need you teaching up here." So I didn't know how to teach. And so I went to an FBI in-service on how to teach. And I've been teaching for a while. And so I've always worked hard at, what worked out here? Why didn't this work? If it did work, why am I uncomfortable with it? Um, what are the requirements and the realities? Like when I went to the adjunct at Georgetown, I said, "How you grade?" And he said, "It's a straight point system. They get points for participation for doing, period. If they do it, they get a point. If they don't do it, they don't get a point. It's completely objective." Now at Harvard, it had been very subjective. They wanted you to see if the student thought. And John Richardson once told me, like, your A students are going to be the ones that tell you everything that you told them and then find the flaws in it and tell you you're wrong. And somebody who disagrees with you and they got a legitimate point, that's your A student. But that's really subjective. And the Georgetown guy was like, academics, they don't like subjectivity. They want objectivity. So points for participation. And he says, then there'll be a natural curve. It'll be easy for you. You just give them a point for this, you give them a point for that, and the curve will be there. And I remember saying to him, what if everybody does everything? And there's no, how do you curve that? He goes, it never happens. And the amygdala, but what if it does? Oh my God, what if it does? And he looked at me and says, I've taught this course 33 times and it hasn't happened once. So the first time I taught, I was just straight objective. But then I thought, hey, I got to evaluate their skill level. And so I just started throwing together the ideas that I picked up at Harvard and what I was learning at Georgetown and came up with a really good assessment of their negotiation ability that made them think. And then from that, by the time I called these application of course skills papers. And after doing it 3-4 times, I thought I had it down where they really thought it through. So consequently, by the time we got ready to teach the book, I had 200 real life great examples of how the skills worked. And we went through those 200 examples and I had them categorized by skill or by type of negotiation, whether it was a Wall Street deal or whether it was a commercial real estate acquisition. And sat down with Tal Raz, who's a brilliant researcher in and of himself. And I said, look, I got all these real life examples. They're written up already and they're concise and they're digestible. And so with me and Tal, principally, we went through and decided which papers to use. And then as we fleshed out the ideas in the book, my son, you're very familiar with Brandon, my son. Brandon was very much involved in the editing and making sure that we got the ideas expressed properly.
Not many people win the lottery, and it's statistically proven to ruin your life if you do. So you shouldn't want to win the lottery anyway. So like, there's so few things in life when you look at it are really a genuine surprise. I mean, there are certain things that are like, all of a sudden you get, your heart gives out. I mean, there are things that can be a surprise, but most of the time, if we were paying attention, we would see in a case like that maybe our health is slipping. Maybe we're not taking care of ourselves. Maybe we're not doing what we should be doing. Maybe we're not seeing the doctor often enough. And then the positive side, like, I was elated when I won my first Emmy, but not in an arrogant way, but I wasn't shocked. I mean, I had done the work to get an Emmy nomination and I had done the best work I could possibly do and done a lot of research to try to figure out how to win. And so I was elated, but I wasn't shocked. And so there are so few things in life that come as a surprise and that come without the best things, at least without a severe amount of just gritting it out, And so I think it's probably really helpful for people to hear there's other ways to create a great book, but it's no surprise, and wasn't a surprise to you, I'm sure. Maybe you were pleased with how the world received it, but it's not a surprise it was a good book because you literally had, I mean, probably 10 times the amount you needed for a great book. And you were able to whittle it down, work with great people like Tall and then Brandon to really hone it in. I mean, the work had been done. People were going to think what they were going to think of it. I remember when I did Dickie V's documentary, I worked with a guy named John Dahl. And John, I was really worried when ESPN bought our documentary because I'd never worked with anyone over there. And I was just, I just was worried that someone was going to come in and try to mess with the vibe we had that I really liked. And he ends up being John Dahl, and John, was one of the co-creators of a little-known series called 30 for 30, and he worked on a little-known docu-series called The Last Dance. I was like, oh, okay, now I'm just nervous. I'm just intimidated, but nicest guy ever, and basically he just kept saying, hey, trim out this 4 seconds here and just keep going. Hey, trim out that 8 seconds here, but just keep going. I really like to see this. He's just a great cheerleader, great guy, and he helped us make a much better movie. But when we would get, when it got released and we started getting critical reviews, my favorite thing was he would forward them to me and he would say, now this guy gets it. Now this lady doesn't get it. Like it wasn't, he was basically telling me, don't worry, this is the review, but the reviewer gets it or doesn't get what we were trying to accomplish. And so I now look at when I release something to the world, I do the work ahead of time and I try to think through, but the way it's received is the way it's received. And my favorite lens now is they get it or they don't get it based on what I was trying to achieve. Like, people will say, Nick Nanton makes love letters to whatever. And it's like, well, yeah, that's the documentary I want to make. I want to show you what I love about this person. If you want to make a different documentary, feel free to make a different one, but that's not what I was trying to do. So they get it or they don't get it. So that's my new criteria for when I release something to the world, but not a surprise. Like I said, few people hit the lottery. The other thing that I think is really interesting that you talk about is that talent often quits. And I just, man, that's like a universal law almost. I mean, not always that way, but so many people with great gifts. And I often analyze this. And because I, like yourself, I speak to a lot of audiences and everyone has some version of imposter syndrome. If you don't, you're probably not reaching far enough and you're probably not being introspective enough. You're not self-aware enough, like all those things. There's a line you can cross between, healthy and not healthy. I think self-aware and self-conscious are two sides of the same coin. Like I want my kids to be self-aware. I don't want to be self-conscious. Like that's not a fun place to be. But it's really interesting that, our friend Dan Sullivan calls it unique ability. You can call it gifts. You can call it talents. It's really interesting that the gifts that are our greatest gifts, our most refined gifts, we value the least because we just woke up with them. Like, I don't think Shaquille O'Neal is enamored with dunking a basketball. He probably thinks that's like child's play. Like he was born being able to do that. And so what I find, there's a really unique place for mastery and there's a unique place in the world for people who have a talent and then they hone their skills at the same time. And I think that just in this instance, that's why your business, your book, hopefully your film, I think it will, is going to be well received and successful because you have a talent, but you took the time to create a skill with it. I've never articulated that well, so I may not have quite the right vocabulary around it, but I have noticed that those who take the opportunity to do that, you typically end up creating a category for yourself, which is because most people don't have the same talents and haven't worked on the same sides of the skill. I actually remember one of the first conversations I had with you was like, hey, well, first of all, I've said it multiple times, so like I didn't want to read your book. Like I had read more negotiation books than I wanted to in law school. I didn't love them. You know exactly the ones they were. But we had a bourbon the very first night we met, which is sort of apropos, I guess. The very first night I met you. And I was like, I like this guy. I probably should have him on my podcast. I should probably read his book. So I did, and I loved it. I always tell people some of my top 10 of all books I've ever read. And, it created a space for you. And I think that people, when they're worried about what their space should be in the world, like if you were to look at what your talent is, because most people's talents are, again, you're so gifted at it, you don't value it at all. And it would be massively valued to somebody else if you took the time to articulate it in a way that others could use it as a skill too. So perhaps that might help some others who are trying to figure out what is their place in the world, if they have that imposter syndrome. It's, I think, again, really helpful just to hear how that all came together. You mentioned living on a boat, which I think is fascinating. um, I've learned a lot from you about living on a boat. There's a community that forms. I learned from you about around people living on a boat. You can't live by yourself. By nature, you're sort of, typically you're at some sort of a marina. You have to rely on other people for security, or at least a sense of security. You have to rely on other people to let you know if your boat's on fire. What enticed you to live on a boat? What was it like? Would you do it again? Where did you live on a boat? So many questions about boats.
Yeah, well, first time I thought about it, I ran into an agent named David Wolf in the New York City office of the FBI who's living on a boat. And I'm like, oh, wow, wow, that's kind of interesting. What's that like? And he said, look, this is where my boat is. And it's on the Jersey side of the Hudson River, even with Midtown. And I'm paying $500 a month for my slip, and I've got literally $1 million view of Manhattan. And I go, oh, that sounds interesting. He says, yeah. So, a couple of nights, I'm taking some people out on the Hudson. We're going to go for a cruise. And why don't you come down, check it out, see what it's like? And I get down there, and he's on a pretty small trawler-sized boat. Yeah, I don't know if it was 35, 34, 35 feet. The boat ultimately I ended up living on was 44. And I remember parking down there, and I'm going like, good God, your view of Manhattan is spectacular in the daytime, and in the night it's just like, on land people are paying millions of dollars and you're paying 500 a month for this. This is nuts. And he's like, yeah, well, where do we go out? And we took the boat out, and he took a bunch of people out on the water. We cruised around Manhattan that night, and it was just as stunning as you could imagine it would be. And I was newly single, and I thought, all right, so economical way to live somewhere spectacularly, and also have the option of taking a boat out whenever you feel like it. And so I start shopping for a boat. At the time, I'm thinking I'm gonna jump into this thing in New York, and I get transferred to DC to headquarters, the unit crisis negotiation unit, combination of Quantico and headquarters. So I'm like, all right, I've made this emotional commitment. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull the trigger on this. And I ended up getting a boat, and bought in Baltimore, moved it to DC, and I was lucky I didn't sink the darn thing. I mean, I was just, this David Wolf helped me move the boat, and I was beyond stupid in terms of all the things that I didn't know about boats. But fortunately, I'm very coachable. I learned quickly, and I'm relatively careful. And we getting the boat from Baltimore to DC was an adventure in and of itself. And when you have a boat, pretty much every time you take it out of the slip, it's a bit of an adventure. Now, what I didn't imagine was the community. I had no idea how engaged the community is for a whole variety of reasons. The community is phenomenal. You're going to be surrounded by upbeat, adventurous people. Otherwise, they wouldn't have a boat. And they love the idea of taking it out, and they're optimistic. Even the most pessimistic people are fun to be around. Like when I first got there, the boat that I was right next to, the woman and her husband, German woman, Italian guy husband, she was famous for being grumpy, but she was a great person. Was relatively speaking, and I joked around with her a lot, and people look out for you, and because you have to. There's your boat could sink while you're at work if somebody's not watching. If they see boats, about one boat a year sinks in every marina, and they go down really, really slowly until the water level reaches what's called the through holds. And if it goes through the through holds, it'll sink in a matter of minutes, having just slowly been settling for hours. So you got to watch out for people's boats, or a boat catches on fire, all these reasons why the community is just really involved with one another. And you see them every day. Like if you're living on the boat, you're walking past these people in the morning. You're walking past them in the afternoon. They're sitting there on their aft deck. That's their back porch, but it's 10 feet away. And hey, how are you? And we'll celebrate with you at the drop of a hat. Yeah, I came back in the middle of January one time. Happened to be an extraordinarily warm day. I'd been in the Philippines. And I came back on this really warm, sunny day in January. A couple of guys were sitting out on the decks just having a beer. And I'm like, yeah, I'll have a beer. And it's just, the community is great in and around boats. And that's one of the most gratifying things where you meet people. Somebody's traveling around the world. 2 or 3 people come through every year that they're cruising the world on a boat. And you want to hear their stories. Like, you took your boat down the Mississippi, through the Great Lakes, down the Mississippi, through the Erie Canal. Like, tell me about what that's like. And you're around a lot of really wonderful, positive people.
Adventurers. Yeah, I never would have imagined even trying to live on a boat, first of all. And it makes so much sense, the type of people who are drawn to it, that would be interesting and intriguing. I guess the thing that I think scares probably a lot of people off from it is like the water plays for keeps, right? So like, what did it take you to feel proficient, or did you never feel like, when you sold your last boat and got off it, did you feel like I could take care of any boat, anything? Or is it like, man, I'm really glad this one thing never happened, because if that ever happened, I was screwed?
Well, yeah, and you make a very good point. Water plays for keeps. I mean, it's a great recreational environment. I'd always been a very good swimmer and very comfortable around water growing up. One of my mother's favorite phrases that every child in our family could repeat was hearing mom say, "Well, I was a lifeguard." And mom was adamant that we all just be good swimmers and really capable in the water. And you learn early on that, yeah, like this great recreational place, the wrong mistake and it's extremely unforgiving. So I accepted that as part of being in the recreational environment. And then you get there and you begin to learn, if you study it ahead of time, you learn you're going to make mistakes. I took a boating course while I was still in New York, while I was shopping for the boat. I didn't want to be completely ignorant. And one of the guys teaching the boating course said, there's no excuse for running aground, and you will. And I'm like, okay. You're gonna pay attention or lose attention or make a mistake. And I had a lot of people that knew boats that said, like, you get caught off guard because you don't think you're going very fast, and because you're not going that fast, suddenly you'll be in a lot of trouble.
Hmm.
And when I originally brought the boat down from Baltimore to DC, and one of the guys I work with, Dennis Braden, great guy. Dennis has since passed on, a great friend. I had lived on a boat in Hawaii, and he just kept saying, "Somebody's bringing the boat down with you, right? You got some, I'll go with you. I'll go with you. I'll do, but somebody who knows boats is bringing a boat down, right?" And like he kept pestering me about it. I'm like, "What's the big deal? I mean, I grew up around lakes. Stay away from the shore. It should be fine." And when I finished and brought it down, I looked at Dennis and he says, "How was the trip?" And I said, "Well, I'm not done doing stupid things." And he looked at me and says, "Well, you're not dead, are you?" And so you just come to accept the fact that you got to stay on your toes, and things are going to go bad. And ideally, you don't ever sink the boat. And fortunately, I never did. What's the phrase? Don't go any faster than you want. Don't go any faster into the dock than you want to hit it. So you
I
start
can't
catching
imagine
on.
parking a boat that size too. That's got to be tough.
First couple times, and that's why some people have you practice. And I always had a boat that had twin propellers, and you get and no bow thrusters. I didn't cheat with a bow thruster. Bow thrusters are for cheaters. They're like training wheels on a bike. and you start moving around with twin propellers and taking your time, and you pretty much feel like you could probably steer anything if you're paying really close attention. I once had an opportunity to go out on a Navy vessel, a destroyer, and I ended up my boss overruled, but I just wanted to go out on it because I was going to ask him if I could steer it.
Nice, very nice. Last couple questions. As you know, you've now been teaching the book and other skills for years now. Um, I know you're always thinking, learning new things. Are there any things that I don't want to say you wish you'd included in the book, but now that you've taught so much of it, it maybe is more relevant than you thought, or a new skill you learned that it is as relevant as the things you taught in the book, but it's not in there?
There really isn't anything. If we had to do it over, the first part of the book, I was a little tough on my Harvard colleagues. I was probably tougher than what was necessary in trying to distinguish my methodology from the Harvard methodology, because I learned a lot from them, and they were always very generous to me. Bob Manukin, Sheila Heen, Doug Stone, John Richardson. Without them, they were critical teachers along the way, and they're still people I have tremendous amount of value for. I think the book pretty much as is. I wouldn't change a thing. Now, there's been a lot that we've learned since, and there's been a variety of projects that we're putting out there to supplement it. The whole idea of proof of life: is there a deal, and is the deal with you? It never occurred to me that that would be a big problem in the business world, that people would be constantly engaged in the negotiations, having no intention of ever making the deal. Or there's one thing that we're talking about now, contemplation, working back and forth with Derek Gaunt. There's something we call the agreement graveyard.
Hmm.
Even if you got proof of life on the deal, that's not necessarily going to keep it out of the graveyard. And there's a fair amount of supplemental information that we've learned that I don't regret that we didn't put it in the book. Maybe we didn't know it at the time. I'm not comfortable with how hard I was on Harvard at the beginning of the book. But there's still a lot that we've learned since that we're constantly putting out there in one form or another.
Love it. Well, they can learn more. Keep following along. Obviously, our documentary, Tactical Empathy, will be out soon. There's a lot in that. You've got more books, more things coming out. Black Swan Group, Chris Voss. Always a pleasure to speak with you, my friend. Thanks for taking the time. And everyone, check out all of Chris's stuff. Like it, subscribe, all the other fun things. And thanks for joining us on this episode of Question Able.